Allison Bennett paused on the threshold of Marcus's kitchen, hesitating for the barest instant before stepping into the dimly lit dining room. The late afternoon sun had slipped behind the brick facades across the street, leaving streaks of orange and purple to swirl through the high arched windows. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams of light, and the hush that clung to the room felt heavy, almost sacred. It was the kind of quiet that made every footstep echo, every breath seem amplified, and every eye in the restaurant feel like it was watching her. She carried only a small leather satchel and her ever-present notebook, the tools of her trade as a culinary critic. Tonight, however, her purpose extended beyond mere notes on flavor profiles. Yesterday, Marcus Harris, the celebrated chef owner, whose name graced the front of the building, had looked her square in the eye and refused her service. "I don't serve your kind here," he'd said, his voice low but unmistakable. The words had landed like a physical blow, and the sting of them lingered in Allison's mind as she approached the hostess stand. The hostess, a young woman named Rosa, managed a polite smile that faltered the moment she recognized Allison. "Good evening, Ms. Bennett," Rosa said quietly, stepping aside to let her pass. She avoided eye contact with the chef, whose presence loomed just beyond the pass into the kitchen. Allison caught a glimpse of Marcus's broad shoulders and the crisp white of his chef's coat before Rosa led her to a table in the far corner, an isolated spot bathed in the dying light. As Allison settled into the chair, she set her satchel on the floor, unzipped it, and extracted her notebook and a pen. Every instinct in her body screamed for action, to stand, to confront, to walk out. But her training told her to observe first, record later. She smoothed the pages of the notebook, flexed her fingers, and watched as servers moved silently along the dark wood floorboards, their steps muffled by the thick rugs that ran between tables. A moment later, the soft clink of silverware drew her attention to the bar, where a cluster of regulars nursed their drinks in uneasy conversation. One man glanced over his shoulder, saw Allison, and whispered something to his companion. The companion shook his head as if warning the first not to stare. The air hummed with whispered curiosity and something else, something more fragile, like hope that tonight might yet unfold differently. Allison closed her eyes briefly and inhaled deeply. The scent of garlic sizzling in olive oil, the earthy aroma of mushrooms, and the faint trace of tomatoes simmering in red wine all came to her in a single, intoxicating wave. These were the fragrances that had drawn her to this place in the first place. Marcus's reputation for bold, unorthodox flavor combinations. Yet tonight they felt tainted by the memory of exclusion. A server approached, a tall young man with dark hair and anxious eyes. He stopped just short of the table and cleared his throat. "Ms. Bennett, would you care for some water?" His voice was careful, as though each word might trigger an avalanche of tension. Allison nodded. "Still, please. Sparkling if you have it." The server nodded and retreated. She flipped open her notebook to a blank page and momentarily focused on the indentation of the lines. When the water arrived, the fizzing of the bubbles was loud in the stillness. She thanked him and poured a sip, rolling it on her tongue before setting the glass down. She tapped the tip of her pen against the table 3 times, a habit she used to center herself before writing. Then, of course, there was the menu. She picked it up, letting the soft leather cover fall open in her hands. The dishes were as she remembered: crispy polenta with smoked paprika aioli, braised short ribs with parsnip puree, and the risotto, the signature item, made with wild chanterelles and finished tableside with white truffle oil. Normally, the sight of those words would have made her pulse quicken with anticipation. Tonight, they made her stomach clench. 20 minutes passed. The restaurant's ambient lighting dimmed further as twilight settled outside. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. Somewhere behind the swinging door of the kitchen, a spoon scraped against a pan. Allison's fingers traced the edge of the table as she waited, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, that heavy wooden door swung open and Marcus Harris stepped out. He looked older than his 40 years, if only by a shade. His hair, once meticulously styled, fell in wisps across his forehead. His white coat bore faint smudges of flour and sauce, evidence of a day's work. He paused, surveying the room, and his gaze landed on Allison. For a heartbeat, his expression was unreadable. Then he squared his shoulders and approached her table. Allison closed her notebook and looked up. Their eyes met. In that instant, the hush snapped taut around them. Servers froze mid-stride, patrons leaned forward. The barmaid halted her glass polishing. Marcus stopped 2 feet from her chair and cleared his throat. "I'd like to apologize," he said, his voice low but carrying. Yesterday I acted in a way that he faltered, as if the words were not used to passing his lips. Allison waited, silent. I let fear and ignorance override my principles, he finished, eyes heavy with remorse. I would like to make it right. If you're willing, I'll prepare tonight's risotto myself and personally ensure you receive the hospitality you deserve. Allison studied him for a long moment. The wine-dark wood of his coat contrasted sharply with the earnestness in his eyes. Around them, the restaurant remained suspended as though the entire room hung on her response. Finally, she nodded once. All right, she said softly. I'll be happy to try your risotto. As Marcus gave a curt nod and turned to re-enter the kitchen, the door swung shut behind him with a sense of finality. A tremor of tension lifted from the air, replaced by the faint, hopeful murmur of resumed conversation. Allison reopened her notebook, exhaled, and prepared to document the second chance and the first taste of Marcus Harris's renowned creation. Allison spent the night in restless vigil, the glow of her laptop screen painting pale shadows across her living room walls. She poured herself a second cup of strong black coffee, its steam curling like a silent promise against the cold glass of the window. Outside, streetlights blinked off one by one as the city sank into slumber. Inside, her fingers flew over the keyboard as she distilled yesterday's humiliation and today's defiance into a single, searing narrative. She began with the scene at the restaurant. Marcus's tall frame blocking the pass, the hush that fell over the dining room the instant he refused her service. She described the sudden silence of the guests, the careful slide of the hostess's tray, forgotten midway to a table, the tremor in the server's hand as he replaced water glasses. She wrote of the taste she never sampled, the risotto left unserved, and the delicious cruelty of exclusion. Then she shifted tone, tracing Marcus's legacy as a chef, his rise from a modest apprenticeship under an Italian nonna, his fearless experimentation with mushroom reductions and saffron threads. This was not the portrait of a villain. It was the portrait of a man who had built his reputation on creation, only to mar it with prejudice. As dawn broke, Allison polished her prose. She added context, local civil rights groups that had quietly protested the restaurant's ecosphere of whispered rumors, old customers who had quietly stopped visiting, uneasy staff members who tiptoed around the kitchen in fear of temper flares. She framed Marcus's refusal not as an isolated outburst, but as the culmination of undercurrents that his establishment had long ignored. Finally, she inserted her closing line, a challenge to every reader to consider that hospitality must extend beyond the kitchen door to the very souls who dine there. At precisely 8 o'clock, the piece went live on the magazine's website. Allison watched the page views tick upward, 100, 200, then 2,000 within minutes. Notifications pinged on her phone. Retweets, shares, angry comments, ardent endorsements. The article's title blazed across social feeds in all caps. Chef refuses service to Black critic. Can taste alone make up for racism? It became a rallying cry for food bloggers, activists, even late-night radio hosts. By mid-morning, the story had spread to every corner of the city. A local breakfast show invited Allison on air to discuss the ethics of dining culture. She fielded calls from listeners who had once admired Marcus's daring palate, but now questioned the man behind the stove. You've got to hold people accountable, one caller declared. Flavor means nothing without fairness, another added. On Twitter, the hashtag Judge Boycott Harris Kitchen trended. Instagram stories featured photos of empty tables and black squares in solidarity. The front page of the online news portal published her article, alongside a photograph of Marcus's grim-faced profile. Meanwhile, inside Marcus's kitchen, pandemonium ruled. Servers huddled near the coat rack, phones pressed to ears as PR consultants and food critics dialed in. The hostess locked herself in the supply closet when she saw a camera crew approach the entrance. Marcus himself was holed up in his office, a cramped space with peeling wallpaper and a single window that overlooked the alley. He ran his trembling hands through his hair and stared at the voicemail messages piling up. Apologies and demands, condolences and condemnations. His manager, Elena, appeared at the door, her eyes red-rimmed under dark circles. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. We can't just sit here, she said. You need a statement. You need to show them you mean it. He nodded numbly. I'll do it, he whispered. I'll do whatever it takes. At noon, Marcus stepped into the near-empty dining room to record a video apology on his phone. The light was harsh, the walls too close, but his voice was steady as he spoke of regret and education, of promises to partner with local community leaders and to fund scholarships for aspiring chefs of color. He posted the clip across the restaurant's social channels, praying it would quell the outrage. But the public's appetite for accountability was anything but satisfied. 3 hours later, an online petition calling for a license review had amassed over 10,000 signatures. Editorial boards weighed in. Some argued for second chances, others demanded permanent closure. A rival chef offered free meals to anyone who had been refused service at Marcus's kitchen. The tension became almost palpable. By early evening, the hashtag morphed into the serve all or shutdown, and news vans lurked at the curb, their cameras aimed at the shuttered front door. Back at her apartment, Allison watched the unfolding drama with both satisfaction and unease. She had set the narrative in motion, but she did not relish the power to determine someone's fate. She took a sip of cooling coffee and considered her next move. Whether to augment the piece with interviews from the kitchen staff who had witnessed Marcus's behavior, or to step away and let the fallout run its course. Ultimately, she decided to let truth speak for itself. She drafted a brief follow-up, reminding readers of the human stakes behind every story, both the critics and the chefs. As dusk fell, Allison closed her laptop and stood, listening to the distant wail of traffic and the softer tug of her own conscience. Her voice had been amplified beyond anything she could have imagined, rippling through screens and airwaves and into the heart of a community. The question now was whether Marcus Harris would answer that call for justice with more than words, and whether in his response he could find the redemption his kitchen so desperately needed. Allison rose from her table the instant Marcus's white-coated back disappeared through the swinging door. The low murmur of the dining room faded behind her as she pushed past the last row of tables and crossed the threshold into the kitchen proper. Heat crashed against her in waves, steam billowed from pots, and the clash of metal against metal rang like distant thunder. The stainless steel surfaces gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. Hanging ladles and spatulas formed a jungle of shadows on the far wall. She found Marcus at the central range, his shoulders hunched as he stirred a wide pan of arborio rice in velvet black stock. Beads of sweat traced rivulets down his temples, darkening the collar of his chef's coat. Around him, 2 line cooks darted between stove and prep station, while a sous chef barked instructions and flipped a charred strip of pork belly onto a resting rack. The air tasted of caramelizing onions and pungent garlic. A sudden flash of white truffle oil scorched the back of Allison's throat with its heady perfume. He looked up when she cleared her throat. His face, normally so composed, was pinched with anxiety. He dropped his spoon and stepped back, knocking a small bowl of minced parsley askew. Green flecks scattered across the checkerboard tile floor. Allison knelt to brush them away with her palm as calmly as she could. "I wanted to see you here," she said, voice steady. "I need to understand what happens behind this door." Marcus dabbed at his forehead with the sleeve of his coat. I'm not sure this is necessary," he stammered. "The risotto's almost ready. Perhaps you'd prefer to wait in the dining room?" She stood and closed the gap between them. "I'm not here to taste it yet. I'm here to see you work and to talk." His gaze flicked to the pan, then back to her. He swallowed, wiped his hands on a towel that had once been bright white and now looked stained with years of effort, and nodded. He waved one hand at a side counter crowded with ingredients. "Talk then," he said. "But be warned, I'm no saint." Allison produced her notebook. She didn't open it. Instead, she said quietly, "I want to know why you said what you did. Not for the article, you've read my words by now, but for yourself." He hesitated, then turned the flame under the rice down to a whisper. The steel handle of the pan glowed dull red. He leaned forward, one hand braced on the counter. "I'm from a small town," he began, voice low. "Where I grew up, people like me never saw people like you. We heard stories, some frightening, some full of mistrust. And back then, I was young and stupid enough to believe them." A line cook dropped a sheet pan on a rack, rattling a row of copper saucepans. Allison's pulse thumped in her ears. She waited. "Over the years," he continued, "I buried it, pushed it down under polish and technique and Michelin buzz. But it was always there, a dark undercurrent. I thought I was better than that. I thought skill would erase it." He closed his eyes, as if the confession cost him something. "Until yesterday. When I saw you at the pass, all I could see was my old fear. I snapped." Allison inhaled, tasting the sharp tang of remorse in his words. "You hurt me," she said simply, "and your guests felt it too." He nodded, throat tight. I know, and I'll pay for it. He looked down at the pan. But I need to prove it. Not with an apology, but with action. She studied him in the flickering light of the stove. Sweat beaded at his hairline. His coat sleeves were rolled to reveal forearms dusted with flour. Then show me. Show your team. Show every customer who walks through that door. He squared his shoulders and picked up the spoon. Carefully, he swept a spoonful of rice onto a tasting spoon and handed it to Allison. She couldn't refuse. She raised it to her lips. The rice was al dente, each grain distinct, bathed in a stock that trembled between sweet and savory. A whisper of black pepper lingered on the back of her tongue. She swallowed, closed her eyes, and nodded. His jaw unclenched. "Thank you," he said. Behind her, the line cooks had stopped their work and watched. Marcus turned to them, voice stronger now. "Listen up," he said. "From this moment on, every single person who walks in is treated with respect. No exceptions. If anyone, staff or guest, acts otherwise, we deal with it. You hear me?" A young cook named Javier wiped his hands on his apron and stepped forward. "Chef, we stand with you," he said. "We'll make it right." A murmur of agreement rippled through the brigade. The sous chef, the pastry chef, even the dishwashers who hovered at the door. Allison felt a rush of hope at their solidarity. Marcus turned back to the stove and stirred the risotto's shallow pool of cream and rice. "Now," he said, glancing at Allison, "shall we finish this properly?" She smiled. "Yes, let's bring it home." He ladled the risotto onto a warmed plate, garnished it with a flourish of microgreens and a dusting of parmesan. As he slid the plate toward her, the kitchen felt transformed, no longer a battlefield of prejudice, but a workshop of possibility. Allison lifted her fork and prepared to taste not only the flavors in front of her, but the promise of change that infused every grain. The door between kitchen and dining room swung open, and Marcus Harris stepped out carrying a single gleaming plate of risotto. He moved with a newfound lightness in his step, as though the act of creating this dish had already begun to lift the weight of his guilt. Allison rose from her seat at the back corner table, her notebook closed but still in hand, and watched him approach. Around the room, the low buzz of conversation stuttered and then fell away. Diners set down glasses and menus, eyes fixed on the plate in his hands, as though it carried the promise of something more than mere flavor. He placed the plate before her with deliberate reverence. The risotto was aglow beneath the chandelier light. Each grain of rice was plump and radiant, nestled in a pale pool of truffle-scented cream. Wisps of microgreens and slivers of aged parmesan crowned the swirl, like a circle drawn to contain redemption itself. Marcus drew a breath and met Allison's gaze. "This is for you, and for everyone who believes that a meal can be more than nourishment," he said softly. "It can be an act of respect." Allison picked up her fork and hesitated, letting the charged silence hang for one heartbeat longer. Then she scooped a tender mound of rice, bringing it to her lips with measured care. The first bite was a revelation. The broth carried the deep sweetness of slow-simmered stock, anchoring each grain in a warmth that felt like forgiveness. Chanterelles offered a woodsy echo, their texture melting into the smooth risotto, while the truffle oil wove an undercurrent of luxury that reminded her how fleeting yet precious moments of grace could be. She closed her eyes briefly, savoring not only the flavors, but the intention behind them. When she opened her eyes again, the entire dining room was watching. A hush, greater than before, pressed in, as though every patron had stilled their breath to hear her verdict. Allison set down her fork, placed both hands on the table, and let the silence stretch. Then she spoke. "This is extraordinary. It shows what happens when skill and humility meet." Her voice resonated through the room, firm but gentle, carrying the weight of genuine praise. At her words, a ripple of relief swept through the restaurant. The barmaid exhaled audibly. A cluster of friends at a neighboring table exchanged grins. Servers dared to relax their shoulders, and even the hostess crept from the corner to glimpse the scene. Encouraged, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. In that moment, the gulf between them, the one carved by fear and prejudice, seemed to narrow, bridged by the simple act of sharing a perfect meal. Inspired by Allison's response, Marcus stepped onto the tiled floor at the center of the room and raised his voice so all could hear. "Tonight we commit to serve every guest with the dignity they deserve," he announced. "No matter who you are welcome here." A murmur of applause rose immediately, tentative at first, then growing in confidence until it filled every corner of the dining room. Patrons stood and cheered, toasting with wine glasses raised high. In one swift, jubilant moment, the restaurant that had been shadowed by scandal became a space of collective triumph. Emboldened by the crowd's energy, Marcus called to his team through the pass. "Send out 4 more plates, on the house, for anyone willing to taste." The line cooks nodded, plating additional portions of the signature risotto and handing them off to servers who wove through the tables like swift messengers of reconciliation. Allison watched as plates circulated, guests leaning forward to inhale the heady aroma before sampling the creamy rice. Laughter bubbled up alongside appreciative murmurs. One young couple clinked forks and smiled at each other, while an elderly man dabbed at his eyes with a napkin, shaking his head in disbelief at the transformation taking place. Amid the celebration, Allison slipped from her seat to stand beside Marcus. The kitchen's glow spilled into the dining area behind them, illuminating his chef's coat and her notebook, tucked into his apron pocket. "You've done more than cook," she said quietly. "You've reminded everyone why we break bread together." He nodded, eyes damp, and gave a small bow toward the diners. As the evening waned, word of the kitchen's gesture spread beyond the restaurant's walls. A local food blogger live-streamed the scene. Patrons posted videos of their free risotto with hashtags of reconciliation and hope. By closing time, tables that had sat empty for days were booked solid for the rest of the week. But more importantly, diners left talking not about scandal, but about second chances and the power of hospitality to heal wounds. When the last customer drifted out and the staff began clearing dishes, Allison and Marcus remained at the kitchen pass, surveying the gleaming countertops and emptied pans. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me the chance to make this right." Her smile was warm, unguarded. "Thank you for taking it," she replied. In the quiet aftermath, amid the clink of dishes being stacked, the tap of mops on the tiled floor, the restaurant felt reborn. The night's tasting had not only redeemed a chef's reputation, but had reignited the soul of the place, a sanctuary where every guest could be seen, heard, and honored. And for Marcus Harris, that plate of risotto would forever stand as the moment his greatest creation became the vehicle for genuine transformation. In the days that followed the risotto redemption, Marcus Harris's kitchen became more than a restaurant. It became a living testament to transformation. Early Monday morning, Allison Bennett sat at her favorite cafe table, manuscript pages strewn before her as she prepared her final dispatch. Outside, tentative spring sunlight filtered through budding leaves, echoing the hope stirring in the city's culinary world. She adjusted her glasses, read over her own words, and set her pen to paper one last time. The epilogue of a saga that began with exclusion and ended in collective renewal. Back at the restaurant, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. The once anxious staff now moved with quiet confidence. Javier, the line cook who had first pledged solidarity, led a weekly diversity tasting, where team members sampled dishes from backgrounds they'd never explored. The pastry chef, May, began, experimenting with traditional Southern dessert flavors to honor the community whose voices had compelled Marcus to look inward. In the front of house, Rosa, the hostess, instituted an ongoing welcome table program, inviting guests who might feel unwelcome anywhere else, elderly patrons, new immigrants, LGBTQ couples, to share a meal on the house once each month. Marcus himself rose before dawn every morning. He streaked the steel counters with vinegar to polish away echoes of the past, then studiously reviewed feedback cards clipped to the bulletin board, handwritten notes of gratitude, suggestions for improvement, even cautious critiques from diners, whose trust he had yet to earn fully. He took each one to heart. One card read, "Thank you for believing we belong." Another urged, "Consider a scholarship for chefs of color." By midweek, he had reached out to a local culinary school and arranged to fund a scholarship for 2 students from underrepresented backgrounds. In his office, once the scene of his private turmoil, he now kept a small plaque. "Hospitality begins where prejudice ends." Word of these initiatives spread quickly. Local newspapers ran follow-up stories. Chef funds future through scholarship, and Marcus's kitchen holds first community feast. Television crews returned not to shame him, but to celebrate a model of accountability. Allison's columns drove the narrative. She wrote of how one man's willingness to confront his own bias had sparked a ripple effect that extended far beyond his own kitchen walls. Her final piece ended not with a period, but with an invitation. "May every plate we share remind us that at any moment we can choose compassion over fear." On a particularly bright Thursday afternoon, the restaurant hosted its first Unity Brunch, a free-to-all gathering organized in partnership with neighborhood nonprofits. Long tables stretched across the dining room. At each place, a small card bore the words, "All are welcome." Marcus moved among the guests, greeting families and elders, shaking hands with activists and fledgling chefs. Allison sat near the far end, watching the scene unfold. A young couple clasping hands over chipped ceramic mugs of coffee, a group of college students comparing notes on their favorite dishes, a pair of food critics from rival publications laughing, together as they shared a platter of sweet potato beignets. None of them knew whose plate they would get next. They only knew they belonged. When the last guest rose, Marcus stepped onto a chair to speak. He cleared his throat, glancing at Allison, who raised her notebook in solidarity. Then he looked out at the crowd, which now numbered well over 100 people. "When I first opened these doors," he began, voice cracking with emotion, "I thought I was building a legacy of flavor. I never imagined I was building a legacy of fear." He paused, letting the silence reinforce his words. "But today I stand here humbled, grateful for the forgiveness you've extended me, determined to prove that every dish from this kitchen will nourish not only the body, but the spirit. To everyone in this room, thank you for showing me that true hospitality means serving every soul with dignity." A wave of applause swept through the room, but the most meaningful reaction came from the very back, where Rosa stood beside a small boy, who had been carried here by his grandmother. The boy, 12 years old, shy beyond his years, raised his voice in a clear, unwavering tone. "Thank you, Chef Marcus," he said. "It means the world." Marcus looked down at him, tears glinting in his eyes, and nodded. It was the affirmation he had longed for, not from critics, but from a young person whose life might now be enriched by an act of simple, sincere welcome. By the weekend, reservation lines stretched around the block, but the kitchen never returned to business as usual. Marcus implemented open Sundays. When he taught an afternoon cooking class on cultural cuisines and the history of food as a bridge between peoples, students from all backgrounds signed up. Immigrants sharing recipes from home, local chefs exchanging techniques, neighbors forging friendships over simmering pots and sizzling skillets. In her apartment that Sunday evening, Allison read through the final proofs of her article for the print edition. She paused at a photograph. Marcus and the boy from the brunch, apron mingled with chef's coat, standing side by side and holding a steaming paella pan they'd cooked together. She underlined the caption, "Passing the torch of hospitality to a new generation." Then, she folded the pages, tucked them into an envelope, and prepared to send it off to the editor. Late that night, as the city lights twinkled across her windowsill, she reflected on the arc of the story she had borne witness to. The moment Marcus's fear unfurled into apology. The instant that apology blossomed into action. The day when an entire kitchen and a community embraced a new vision of welcome. She understood now that the true legacy of Marcus's kitchen would not be Michelin stars or glowing reviews, but the knowledge that one person's change of heart could reshape countless others' lives. And somewhere in that realization lay the promise that every restaurant, every table, and every diner carries the power to build a better world, one meal, one apology, one choice at a time.